I'm not going to start. I thought I'd better see that I could actually see the page from here, but it's okay. I don't need my glasses. I wanted just to start off by saying a little bit about Mirror Prince is actually my first published fantasy novel, and I just want to say a little bit about where I got the idea for it. As people who know me know, I'm the child of immigrants. My father's Polish and my mother's Spanish. And I've spent a lot of my life explaining to people that I don't make cabbage rolls and that I don't dance flamenco. And so I learned very early that people have a kind of stereotypical way of thinking of other cultures. And we all do this, and it's done to us as well. So it's just a common human thing. And I thought, well, what if that sort of mistaken way of stereotyping other people's cultures applied to non-human races as well? And of course, the non-human race that we, as in the Western civilization, are most familiar with is the race of fairies or elves. And what if we understood just about as much of their civilization as the untraveled person understands about Japan or Italy or Spain or Poland? And in other words, what if we had it all wrong? So what are those cultures really like? And for example, we think of them as fairies. And by fairies, of course, I mean Tolkien fairies, not Arthur Conan Doyle fairies. And well, they don't think of themselves as fairies. They think of themselves as riders, because that's what they do. They ride. And when you think about it, when our culture connects with the fae culture, most often we see them on horseback. And that's why they think of themselves as riders, because that's what they do. So, and I started thinking about, well, what else could we have gotten wrong? And above all, why haven't we seen any around lately? Because, there was a time when it seemed like you couldn't turn a corner without running into somebody from the unseelie court or what have you. Well, nowadays, they're never around. Well, what happened to them? So I thought, well, suppose there was a war in their land, and they needed to exile someone. And this is the only place they could exile him to. So they did. And then, of course, they couldn't have a lot of traffic between the worlds, because you know what happens when you exile somebody and you allow traffic. His supporters go and rescue him. So they shut off all contact between their world and ours. And that's why for about the last 1,000 years or so, we haven't seen any fairies, really. And that is the setting, or the setting for the Mirror Prince. So the part I'm going to read to you right now comes from the beginning, close to the beginning. And it actually takes place in the streets of Toronto. What's happened is that Max Ravenhill is the man who is the exile. He doesn't realize that he's a fairy prince. He thinks he's a human being. He's about to find out different. He's just been snatched on Queen Street. The people holding him folded Max into the back seat of what felt like a large car. No, he thought, I need to lie down. He thinks he's been hit by a car. He wasn't sure whether he'd spoken aloud. The car door closed, and Max felt hot, moist breath on his cheek. He turned and looked directly into the panting muzzle of a large dog, inches away from his face, so close that Max recoiled, banging his elbow on the car door. He blinked, but his eyes refused to focus. The dog, light-colored with dark markings, at first looked short-muzzled like a bulldog, and then long and razor-mouthed like a wolfhound, the image blurring and flickering until Max felt nauseated. Only the eyes, black as holes and intelligently aware, never changed. The sickly, sweet scent of old meat grew stronger, and Max shut his eyes, willing the insulating blackness to grow thicker. The car rolled forward with a jerk that almost spilled Max to the floor and caused the dog to stand up on the seat. Saliva dripped on him from the dog's jaws, and Max's stomach lurched again. They hadn't gone far when the door of the car was wrenched open and something yanked Max bodily out, knocking his head against the doorframe. A voice he strained to recognize called to him to run, and Max found himself able to stagger a couple of steps. On the third or fourth step, the numbness abruptly disappeared, and the world came into sharp and normal focus. He had no idea in what direction they were running, or even what street they were on, but the woman who had hold of his wrist seemed to know where she was going, and that at the moment was good enough for him. His rescuer was almost his own height, wearing a black ankle-length coat. Her thick blonde hair, crisply curling in the damp air, was held back with a silver clip, and she had a long leather bag with an ornate silver clasp slung over one shoulder. Max's right wrist was clamped in her gloved hand, and when she turned the corner into a more deserted street, Max instinctively dragged back a little. The woman increased the pressure on his arm and at the same time turned her head to look at him. Recognition relaxed him, and Max exerted himself a little until they were running side by side, her hand still firmly on his wrist. Cassandra? Run! Where are we going? They had turned another corner and still she didn't slow down. This way! The alley she pulled him into was about 15 feet wide, long and dark, with a chain-link fence connecting the buildings at the far end. A motion sensor clicked and a light came on, showing Max a loading platform along the left side of the alley. Cassandra pushed him behind her into the shadow created by the platform and turned to face the entrance. She slipped the long bag off her shoulder and lowered it to the cracked concrete, close to Max's feet. The way she handled it told him the bag was heavier than it looked. With a sound like a sharp whistle, she drew a sword out of the top of the bag. Max saw that what he had mistaken for the bag's elaborate closure had actually been the sword's hilt. Cassandra shrugged off her coat as well, leaving her in a dark red t-shirt, a pair of heavy black jeans faded almost to silver tucked into knee boots. She was wearing gloves as finely scaled as fish skin, the same bright silvery material as the sword, with gauntlets that reached almost to her elbows. I saw only one. Were there more? What? Max dragged in a lungful of cold air. You always thought you were in great shape until you had to run for your life. Then you wish you spent more time at the gym. The hound. I saw only one. Oh, yeah, I think so. Cassandra nodded. We have a chance then. Max watched as she crept forward, her eyes focused on the opening of the alley. Light from the street lamp touched the curve of her cheek like a lover's fingertip. Max took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Cassandra tilted her head, straining to listen. Max could hear nothing over the sound of his own breathing. He edged closer to have a look for himself. Without turning, Cassandra put her palm flat against his chest and held him back from the edge of the wall. Stay behind me. Cassandra, it's me, Max. I'm quite capable of recognizing you, Mr. Ravenhill, thank you. Her cool tone took Max right back to the party where they had met. He almost laughed. Just not capable of returning my phone calls. She spared him a glance over her shoulder before returning to her lookout. Which would you prefer? That I stay by the phone to return your calls, or that I pull you out of the cars of people trying to kidnap you? Well, if it's one or the other, I choose the bit with the cars. Everything's turned out well then, hasn't it? She flicked another glance at him. Did they hurt you? Were you bitten? Max shook his head. I banged my head, but I feel okay. Here it comes. Stay back and don't look it in the eyes. Now Max could hear it, the soft sound of a dog's great paws padding along the concrete. Faster than he could have imagined possible, the large dog he had seen in the car rounded the corner of the alley, moving so quickly it almost lost its balance as its claws scratched for traction on the slick concrete. As soon as it saw Cassandra, it leaped, and for a moment Max thought she wouldn't be able to get out of the way. Faster than he could follow, she ducked and twisted, the sword whistling through the air, but even as it leaped, the creature changed form. What landed was not hound, but a kind of chimera, its lion's head maned with snakes, and its dragon's tail spiked. After scrabbling to regain its balance, it headed straight for him. Max snatched up the only other thing to hand, Cassandra's shoulder bag, and threw it in the creature's face. It stopped abruptly in mid-leap and fell back, but not from the bonk on the nose that he'd given it. Cassandra had grabbed its spiked tail as it passed her and hauled back on it, slicing the tail off at the root with a quick downward cut of her sword. She wiped her glove clean on her jeans and with the same motion pulled a long dagger out of her boot. The chimera turned its attention back to her, twisting in midair and flickering into yet another monster, hydra-headed with the body of a lizard, both heads and claws reaching out for her, but its injury transformed with it, leaving it tailless and bleeding. "Stay behind me," she called as she dashed forward to slash at the creature's foreleg, her hair flying loose. "It's trying to split us up." Max nodded and shifted his own position. The creature lunged again, and Max lost track of the action as Cassandra moved with blurring speed, and the thing flickered through half a dozen further changes before settling into a leathery, scaled parody of a griffin. Max glanced around and spotted Cassandra's bag where it had fallen after bouncing off the hound's face. He dashed forward and picked it up, wrapping the straps around his fist, and took an experimental swing. With any luck, he could manage a head blow. In the meantime, Cassandra, breathing hard, had landed another cut, this time to the creature's shoulder. Blood flowed freely, but its injuries didn't seem to slow it down. It kept circling, and Max realized that it was maneuvering the woman into the pool of blood. "Watch your feet, there's blood on the ground." Cassandra grinned as if he'd just given her good news. "I'm glad one of us is having a good time," he thought. Cassandra's right heel skidded. Her hands went up, her blades flying into the air, and the creature lunged forward, snatching at her with its neck outstretched. Desperately, Max swung the leather bag, catching the lunging beast on the side of the head. Its saucer eye flicked toward him. Its clawed foot flashed out, but the beast continued moving forward, stepping into its own blood and slipping in its turn. Cassandra twisted on the heel that was still on dry ground, caught her blades in the opposite hands as they came down, stabbed her dagger into the creature's reaching limb, pulling it toward her, encouraging its slide, and simultaneously bringing down her sword left-handed on its outstretched neck. The creature dropped in its tracks, momentum taking Cassandra down with it, its head bouncing off the wall and rolling to a rest at Max's feet. It flickered again, ringing the changes on every form Max had seen, and a few that he hadn't, until it finally took a twisted human form, a man's thin and wasted face, eyes staring, before it faded completely away. The alley was once again empty and quiet, as clean as it had been when they entered it. No beast, no blood, except what still steamed on their clothing. Cassandra was back on her feet, with blades still raised to strike, breathing hard and grinning, a tear in her t-shirt showing not skin, but another gleam of metal. "You did that on purpose," Max accused her. "Made it think you'd slipped in the blood." "They like to kill. It makes them too eager." "How about you? Do you like it?" Now that the adrenaline was seeping out of him, it was all Max could do to control the shaking of his hands. How could she just stand there, smiling? She took a deep breath and looked at him, the light fading from her face, the smile gone. "You're bleeding. Where did it get you?" "What? Nowhere." Max's stomach clenched, and even as he spoke, his knees gave way for the second time that evening. But this time Cassandra caught him before he could hit the ground. He clutched at her arm, getting a handful of strangely warm metal gauntlet. A tremor began in his hand, moved up his arm, and claimed the rest of his body. A spot on his left side, down near the hip bone, felt very cold, and the coldness spread, and a shh of static in his head grew louder and louder as his body floated farther and farther away. Cassandra hissed, and Max felt her hand, warmer than the metal glove should have been, pressed firmly against the icy wound in his side. He could feel her arms cradling him, feel her shift on the cold concrete until his head fell back on her shoulder. She put her mouth on his lips and breathed, and breathed, and breathed. And his body soaked up her breath like a dry wick soaks up oil, filling itself with her warmth and her air, and still Cassandra breathed, until Max began to fear he would empty her, until the cold place in his side finally became warm, and Max took a deep, shuddering breath. What the hell was that? He'd been dying. He was sure of it. And somehow Cassandra had stopped it, had made it simply go away. His side, under the torn and bloody cotton shirt, wasn't even sore. He cleared his throat. His voice sounded as though he hadn't used it in weeks, and he could feel the exhilaration of being alive already beginning to fade. Cassandra walked stiffly over to where her coat lay next to the loading dock. She kept her face turned away from him as she crouched down on her heels, wiping her perfectly clean blades on the skirt of the coat. She glanced back at him as he got to his feet, but otherwise acted as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just saved his life. Twice. Do you know what I mean when I say the hunt? Max blinked as he mentally changed gears. If that's what she wanted to talk about, he was willing to play along. But soon she'd have to explain what it was she'd just done, and how. Well, folklore is not my field, but I believe there are several schools of thought. Max broke off as Cassandra raised her eyebrows. Okay, I take it you mean the wild hunt? So there's huntsmen, horses, hounds, some say human spirits, but most agree it's something to do with the she. Max leaned back on the ledge of the loading dock as if it were the chalk ledge of a blackboard and crossed his arms. Specifically the trooping fairy, yes? They hunted some kind of supernatural prey, didn't they? Max shook his head slowly. It was crazy. It was impossible. But he had seen what he had seen. That's what that was? One of the she? Cassandra put her coat back on and slipped the long, thin dagger back into her boot, her hand trembling ever so slightly. It's the same with all the stories. A little bit right, a little bit wrong. The hunt is not made up of what you call the she. It hunts the she. Max handed Cassandra her bag, but took a step back instead of helping her as she slung it over her head and adjusted it until it hung along her back. Of all the crazy... No, I don't get it. You mean that thing was after you? Cassandra gave a final shrug to her bag and turned until she was looking him in the face. No, my lord, it was after you.